Dawson had spent 3 years learning to read alien faces. She knew when the delegates were nervous by the way their throat sacs pulsed. She could tell when the Morn representatives were pleased by the slight elevation of their cranial ridges. But they were different. Their smooth gray faces revealed nothing, and their black eyes held secrets that stretched back 6,000 years of galactic dominance. Today, as she sat in the grand chamber of the Galactic Concord Station, she watched Executor rise from his seat, and for the first time in 3 years, she saw something on his face. It looked like satisfaction. The chamber was beautiful in the cold way that powerful things often are. Crystal walls filtered starlight into rainbow patterns across the floor. Delegates from 40 species sat in tiered rows, watching the center platform where humanity's fate would be decided. Stood at the human podium with her small team behind her. Cole, her senior aide, shifted his weight nervously. He was young, barely 30, with the kind of earnest face that made other species underestimate him. The 4 other members of her diplomatic staff stood in formal silence, wearing the deep blue uniforms of Earth's diplomatic corps. Or's voice filled the chamber, translated instantly through the neural implants every delegate wore. "The Dominion has considered humanity's petition for sovereign status," he said. "We have studied your species for the decades since your emergence onto the galactic stage. We have watched your expansion into unclaimed systems. We have observed your rapid technological development." He paused and felt her stomach tighten. "We have reached a decision." Had prepared for this moment. She had arguments ready, compromises designed, concessions planned. Humanity had followed every rule, respected every boundary, and contributed to galactic commerce and science. Their petition was reasonable. Their record was clean. She opened her mouth to respond, or raised one long-fingered hand. "Humanity will accept protectorate status under the Dominion," he said. "Your colonies will be administered by Dominion governors. Your fleet will be decommissioned. Your population will serve the greater purposes of the Dominion as we see fit. This is not a negotiation. This is a notification." The chamber erupted in murmurs, saw the delegates exchange glances of barely hidden fear. The Morn representatives looked away, unwilling to meet her eyes. These were species that had lived under Dominion's shadow for centuries. They knew what was coming. "Executor," said, keeping her voice steady, "humanity rejects this proposal. We came here seeking partnership, not subjugation. The Charter of the Galactic Concord guarantees the right of emerging species to sovereign development. We will not surrender our freedom." Or smiled. It was the first genuine expression she had ever seen on a face, and it chilled her to her core. "The Concord's charter applies to species recognized by the Concord," he said. "Humanity has not been recognized. You have no rights here. You have no protections. You have only the choice between submission and consequences." Felt stepped closer behind her. "Ambassador," he whispered, "something is wrong. The security feeds just went dark." She did not have time to respond. The doors of the chamber opened, and soldiers poured in. They were not the ceremonial guards who normally stood watch. These were combat troops in full armor, carrying pulse rifles that hummed with charged energy. The delegates from other species scrambled away from the center of the room, pressing against the walls in terror. "This is a violation of Concord law," said, but her voice sounded small against the march of armored boots. Or descended from his platform and walked toward her with slow, deliberate steps. "There is no law but Dominion law," he said. "There never was. The Concord exists because we allow it to exist. Other species have rights because we permit them to have rights. Humanity has been useful as an example. Your defiance here today will serve as a reminder to every species that watches." He stopped 3 meters from her and gestured to his soldiers. "Remind them." The first shot took diplomat Gregory Shaw in the chest. He fell without a sound, dead before he hit the crystal floor, screamed and lunged forward but grabbed her and pulled her back. More shots followed. Lisa Park fell next, then Christopher Dean, then Maria Santos. Each death was clean and efficient, the work of soldiers who had done this many times before. pushed behind him as the soldiers advanced. "Run," he said. "The emergency pod bay, Section 7, go now." "I will not leave you," she said. "You have to survive," he said. "Someone has to tell them what happened here. Someone has to show them." He pressed his personal recorder into her hand. It had been running since the session began, capturing everything. "Go, please." The soldiers fired, jerked as 3 bolts struck his back and he collapsed against her. Caught him, felt his weight drag her down, saw the light leave his eyes. He was dead in her arms and his blood was warm on her hands and the soldiers were still coming. She ran. The corridors of the station blurred around her as she fled. She heard pulse fire behind her, heard the shouts of soldiers, heard the screams of other delegates caught in the chaos. Her training took over, guiding her feet through paths she had memorized years ago for exactly this kind of emergency. Section 7, Emergency Pod Bay, had died to give her this chance and she would not waste it. The pod bay doors opened to her diplomatic codes. Inside, 6 small escape craft waited in their launch cradles. She threw herself into the nearest one and slammed the activation panel. The pod systems hummed to life. Through the small viewport, she saw soldiers burst into the bay just as the launch sequence engaged. The pod shot into space. Behind her, the Galactic Concord station grew small against the stars. Ahead of her, the void stretched endless and dark. Looked at the recorder in her bloody hands. Final gift. It contained the footage of everything that had happened, every word or had spoken, every shot the soldiers had fired. It contained proof of murder and betrayal. It contained the death of diplomacy. She activated the pod's distress beacon and set course for the nearest human patrol route. As she waited for rescue, she watched the recording. She watched her friends die again and again. She watched shield her with his body. She watched or smile. The thought this would frighten humanity into submission. They thought the massacre would serve as a warning. They did not understand. Humans did not respond to atrocity with fear. They responded with fury. They responded with unity. They responded with a resolve that burned hotter than any star. Dawson had come to the Galactic Concord as a diplomat seeking peace. She would return to Earth as a witness demanding justice. The Dominion had made its choice. Now humanity would make theirs. The stars wheeled slowly past her viewport as she drifted through the dark, waiting, grieving, and planning. The USS Relentless found's escape pod drifting at the edge of the system, its distress beacon crying into the void like a wounded animal. Captain stood on his bridge and watched the small craft being pulled into the hangar bay. He was a tall man with gray at his temples and the kind of quiet authority that came from 20 years of service. He had commanded rescue missions before. He had recovered survivors from pirate attacks and mining accidents and colony disasters. But when he saw Dawson carried from that pod, her diplomatic uniform soaked in blood that was not her own, her eyes hollow with grief and rage, he knew this was something different. The medical team wanted to sedate her. She refused. She demanded to speak with him immediately, and when they tried to insist on treatment, she showed them the recorder. She showed them what was on it. The chief medical officer went pale and called down to the medical bay himself. Played the footage on a wall screen while watched in silence. He saw the chamber, the delegates, the soldiers. He saw the executions. He saw a young man push the ambassador behind him and take pulse bolts in the back. He saw or smile. When it was over, stood very still for a long moment. His hands were clenched at his sides, and a muscle in his jaw twitched with barely contained fury. "How many were there?" he asked quietly. "5 of my staff," said Cole, Gregory Shaw, Lisa Park, Christopher Dean, Maria Santos, all of them unarmed, all of them murdered. Her voice cracked, but she forced herself to continue. "The Dominion has declared humanity a rogue species. They are mobilizing their fleet. They intend to subjugate us or destroy us." Nodded slowly. "Then we need to get this footage to Earth, now." The Relentless broke every speed regulation in the fleet handbook, racing back to Saul. Transmitted the recording ahead through encrypted channels, Priority 1, eyes only for the highest levels of command. By the time his ship entered Earth orbit, the United Nations Emergency Council was already in session. The council chamber in Geneva was packed. Representatives from every nation on Earth sat in tense rows, their faces lit by the blue glow of display screens. Admiral Vance stood at the central podium, her silver hair pulled back tight and her uniform crisp despite the fact that she had not slept in 2 days. She was 63 years old and had commanded the Sol Defense Fleet for the past decade. She had spent her career preparing for a war she hoped would never come. Now it was here. "The footage is authentic," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed chamber. "Our people were murdered in cold blood by Dominion forces. Executor or has broadcast a declaration throughout the galaxy naming humanity as a rogue species subject to immediate pacification. Intelligence reports indicate the Dominion is assembling the largest fleet mobilization in 300 years. Conservative estimates put their numbers at over 4,000 warships." A murmur of fear rippled through the delegates. Defense Minister Samuel Grant leaned forward in his seat. He was a heavy-set man with a calm demeanor that had served him well in decades of crisis management. "And our numbers, Admiral?" 212 combat-ready vessels, said. "Another 80 in various stages of construction or repair." The murmur became a groan. The math was simple and brutal. The Dominion had them outnumbered 20-1. Some delegates began speaking of surrender, of negotiation, of finding some way to appease the inevitable. Let them talk for exactly 30 seconds before she raised her hand. "There is more," she said. When the chamber fell silent, she continued. 30 years ago, after humanity's first contact with galactic civilization, a decision was made at the highest levels of Earth's government. We had seen how the Dominion treated other species. We had studied their history of conquest and subjugation. We knew that one day they might turn their attention to us, so we prepared. She activated a new display, and the screen behind her filled with schematics and deployment maps that made several military delegates gasp aloud. "Project Longbow," said. "A network of hidden weapons platforms distributed throughout human space. Kinetic accelerators capable of launching projectiles at significant fractions of light speed. Directed energy arrays concealed in asteroids and moons. Automated defense grids with AI targeting systems decades ahead of anything the Dominion possesses. We have spent 30 years building weapons we hoped we would never need. Today, I am authorizing their activation." Samuel Grant stood from his seat. "Admiral Vance is right. We prepared for this. We knew the Dominion would never accept humanity as equals. We knew they would eventually try to crush us. The only question was whether we would be ready when that day came." He looked around the chamber at his fellow delegates, at their frightened faces and trembling hands. "We are ready. The question now is whether we have the will to use what we have built." Dawson entered the chamber. She had cleaned the blood from her uniform, but her eyes still carried the weight of what she had witnessed. The delegates fell silent as she walked to the podium. She had been a diplomat, a voice for peace and cooperation. Now she stood before them as something else entirely. "I spent 3 years trying to find a peaceful path for humanity," she said. "I believed that if we were reasonable, if we followed the rules, if we showed that we meant no harm, the galaxy would accept us. I was wrong. The Dominion does not want partners. They want subjects. They do not respond to reason. They respond only to power." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was hard as steel. "Cole died saving my life. Gregory Shaw, Lisa Park, Christopher Dean, Maria Santos. They died because they believed in diplomacy. They died because they trusted that the conquered would protect them. I will not let their deaths be meaningless. We cannot simply defend ourselves and wait for the next assault. We must make the cost of attacking humanity so devastating, so absolute, that no species in this galaxy will ever threaten us again." The chamber was silent. Then Samuel Grant began to applaud. One by one, other delegates joined him until the chamber thundered with the sound of humanity's resolve. Admiral Vance stepped forward. "Then we are agreed. Full military mobilization begins immediately. All reserve forces are called to active duty. Project Longbow is now operational, and I want Captain brought here for consultation. He has tactical proposals that the Dominion will not expect. The orders went out. Across human space, sleeping systems woke up. Hidden platforms emerged from their concealment. Ships that had been held in reserve were crewed and armed. A species that had spent decades pretending to be harmless revealed the truth of what it had become. The Dominion thought humanity would break under the threat of their armada. They thought fear would paralyze their prey and make conquest easy. They did not understand that they had given humanity the one thing it needed to unite. They had given them an enemy, and humanity had been waiting for this fight for 30 years. Admiral had served the Dominion for 200 years. He had commanded fleets against a dozen rebellious species and crushed every one of them. His record was flawless, his reputation fearsome, and his confidence absolute. When Executor gave him command of the Vanguard fleet and ordered him to secure the human colony at 442, he accepted the mission with something close to boredom. 300 warships against a primitive species that had barely mastered interstellar travel. It would not even be a battle, it would be a demonstration. His fleet emerged from faster-than-light travel at the edge of the 442 system in perfect formation. 300 vessels arranged in the classic Dominion assault pattern, heavy dreadnoughts at the center, cruisers on the flanks, destroyers ranging ahead to scout and screen. Stood on the command deck of his flagship, the Eternal Dominion, and surveyed the system on his tactical display. The human colony world hung blue and green in the void, a small jewel waiting to be claimed. "Scan for defensive positions," he ordered. His sensor officer worked for several moments, then looked up with confusion on his face. "Admiral, I am detecting no orbital defenses, no military vessels. The colony appears to be evacuated." His eyes narrowed. "Evacuated?" "Yes, Admiral, surface scans show abandoned structures. No life signs, no power emissions. The humans have fled." Laughter rippled through the command deck. Allowed himself a thin smile. So the humans had heard of his coming and run like prey animals before a predator. It was disappointing but not surprising. Young species often lacked the courage to stand and fight. "Move the fleet to high orbit," he ordered. "We will secure the planet and use it as a forward base. Signal Executor that 442 is ours." The fleet advanced into the system, spreading out to cover the approach to the colony world. Watched his vessels glide through the void with the casual grace of absolute power. Behind him, his officers began discussing plans for occupation and garrison duty. The battle was over before it had begun. Then the system came alive. The first asteroid began to move. Saw it on his tactical display, a rock perhaps 2 kilometers across, suddenly accelerating toward his fleet on a collision course. Before he could order evasive action, the asteroid split apart, revealing the weapon platform hidden inside. A kinetic accelerator the size of a cruiser fired a stream of tungsten rods at velocities that turned simple metal into planet-killing projectiles. 3 dreadnoughts died in the first volley. Their shields, designed to stop energy weapons and missiles, offered no protection against solid projectiles moving at a fraction of light speed. The tungsten rods punched through armor like needles through cloth and detonated reactors in catastrophic chain reactions. Watched 3 of his greatest warships become expanding clouds of debris in the span of seconds. "All ships evasive maneuvers," he shouted. "Return fire on that platform." But there was not just one platform. Across the system, concealed installations revealed themselves. They emerged from moons and asteroids and orbital debris fields, dozens of weapon systems that had been hiding in plain sight. Kinetic accelerators hurled their deadly payloads. Directed energy arrays swept beams of concentrated fury across Dominion formations. Missile pods launched swarms of smart weapons that twisted and danced through point defense fire. The Dominion fleet scattered in chaos. Ships that had been flying in precise formation broke apart as captains tried to escape the killing fields. Screamed orders, trying to restore discipline, trying to coordinate a response, but the attack was too sudden and too devastating. His fleet had walked into a trap designed by minds that understood exactly how the Dominion fought and exactly how to destroy them. Then the human ships appeared. They came from behind the colony world, emerging from the planet's sensor shadow in a coordinated swarm. There were perhaps 40 of them, destroyers and frigates and fast attack craft, tiny compared to the great warships of the Dominion. Felt a moment of hope. His remaining vessels still outnumbered the humans 5-1. Surely they could overwhelm such a small force. But these ships did not fight like any enemy the Dominion had faced before. They moved in perfect synchronization, guided by AI systems that processed tactical data faster than any organic mind could match. They struck in coordinated packs, concentrating fire on single targets until shields failed and hulls breached, then breaking off and reforming before Dominion gunners could track them. They used the debris of destroyed ships as cover, weaving through expanding fields of wreckage with reckless precision. Captain commanded from the bridge of the Relentless, his voice calm as he directed the attack. He had spent weeks studying Dominion tactics, learning their patterns, understanding their weaknesses. They fought in rigid formations because their hierarchy demanded order and discipline. They expected enemies to face them head-on because that was how wars had been fought for. They could not adapt to an enemy that refused to play by their rules. Alpha Wing, concentrate fire on the dreadnought bearing 270, he ordered. Beta Wing, hit their flank cruisers. Gamma Wing, keep their destroyers off our attack runs. Remember, we do not need to destroy them all. We need to break them. The battle became a slaughter. Dominion ships exploded one after another as human vessels darted through their formations like wolves among sheep. Watched his fleet die around him and felt something he had not experienced in 200 years of command. He felt fear. "Admiral," his communications officer called out, "we have lost contact with 17 cruisers. The dreadnought Imperious is reporting critical damage. The destroyer screen has been completely eliminated." Gripped the arms of his command chair until his knuckles turned white. "Order a retreat," he said. The words tasted like poison in his mouth. "All surviving vessels fall back to faster-than-light range. We must regroup." But the human ships were not finished. As the surviving Dominion vessels tried to flee, the weapons platforms adjusted their fire, targeting engines and drive systems. Ships that might have escaped were crippled and left drifting. Human boarding parties launched toward disabled vessels, capturing crews and technology alike. The Eternal Dominion herself took a direct hit from a kinetic accelerator that tore through her rear sections and sent her spinning. Was thrown from his chair as the artificial gravity fluctuated. Alarms screamed throughout the ship. Fire suppression systems activated and failed. The lights flickered and died, replaced by the red glow of emergency power. "Admiral, the reactor is going critical," someone shouted in the darkness. "We need to evacuate." Never made it to the escape pods. A secondary explosion tore through the command deck, and the last thing he saw was fire consuming everything he had known. Of 300 warships, 19 escaped the 442 system. They limped back to Dominion space carrying tales of horror and defeat, of weapons that could not be stopped, and enemies that fought like nothing the galaxy had ever seen. Stood on his bridge and watched the surviving Dominion ships flee. Around him, his crew was cheering, but he did not join them. He knew this was only the beginning. The Dominion would send more ships, larger fleets, greater firepower. This victory had bought humanity time, nothing more. But it had also sent a message. The footage of the battle spread across the galaxy within hours. Species that had lived under Dominion's shadow for centuries watched human ships tear through an armada that should have been invincible. They watched a young species stand against the oldest empire in the galaxy and win. The Dominion had wanted to make an example of humanity. Instead, humanity had made an example of them. The Dominion expected humanity to wait. Every species they had ever conquered followed the same pattern. They would win a battle, celebrate their victory, and then dig into defensive positions to prepare for the inevitable counterattack. They would build walls and pray those walls would hold. They would give the Dominion time to regroup, to gather strength, to bring overwhelming force to bear. This was how wars were fought. This was how young species died. Admiral Vance had studied those dead species. She had read their histories, analyzed their mistakes, and understood their failures. She knew that defense alone was suicide against an enemy with superior numbers. The Dominion could afford to lose 10 ships for every one they destroyed. They could bleed humanity dry through attrition and call it victory. The only way to survive was to refuse to fight on their terms. 3 days after the Battle of, she launched the doctrine. Captain had designed the strategy during his transit back to Earth. It was named after him over his objections, but the name stuck because it captured something essential about humanity's approach to war. Do not stand and fight. Do not give the enemy a target. Strike where they are weak, vanish before they can respond, and make them chase shadows across the stars. Human fleets scattered across 12 systems in a single coordinated assault. They hit supply depots and fuel stations. They destroyed communication relays and sensor platforms. They ambushed convoys and raided forward bases. They never stayed to hold territory. They struck hard and fast and disappeared into the void before Dominion reinforcements could arrive. The Dominion had never faced an enemy like this. Their doctrine was built on decisive engagements, on bringing superior force to bear and crushing opposition through overwhelming power. They did not know how to fight ghosts. Every time they concentrated their fleet to hunt down human raiders, the raiders simply moved to strike somewhere else. Every time they spread their forces to protect their assets, human task forces punched through the gaps and destroyed whatever they found. Commanded the most aggressive of these raiding forces. His task group of 12 ships became legendary among both human and Dominion crews. They struck 4 targets in a single week, destroying a fuel depot, capturing a Dominion cruiser intact, rescuing prisoners from a labor transport, and crippling a communications hub that served an entire sector. The Dominion put a bounty on his head that made him the most wanted human in the galaxy. He responded by broadcasting a message inviting Executor, or to come find him personally. While the military pressed its advantage, Dawson waged a different kind of war. She had been a diplomat, and even now she understood that weapons alone would not save humanity. The Dominion was vast and ancient and powerful beyond measure. Even with Project Longbow and the Doctrine, humanity could not defeat them alone. They needed allies. She began reaching out to species that had suffered under Dominion rule. The collective had been a protectorate for 3 centuries, their people forced to labor in Dominion mines and factories. The Morn Federation had lost 2 colony worlds to Dominion expansion within living memory. A dozen smaller species existed in constant fear of drawing Dominion attention. All of them had watched the footage from 442 with hope they barely dared to feel. Did not ask them to fight. She knew that was too much to request. The Dominion had crushed rebellions before, and the cost of failure was extinction. Instead, she offered something simpler: information, sanctuary, hope. "We are not asking you to join our war," she told the ambassador in a secret meeting aboard a human cruiser. "We are only asking you to watch. We are asking you to remember what the Dominion has done to your people and ours. And we are telling you that if you ever need a place to run, if you ever need ships to protect your escape, humanity will be there." The ambassador was an old female with scars on her throat sacs from decades of Dominion interrogations. She looked at with eyes that had seen too much suffering. "You truly believe you can win?" Thought of Cole, of the blood on her hands, of the friends she had watched die. "I believe that we will never stop fighting," she said. "I believe that the Dominion can kill us, but they cannot defeat us. and I believe that every species in this galaxy is watching to see what happens next." Word spread quietly through the subject species of the Dominion. Humans were fighting back and winning. Humans were offering shelter and support. Humans were not afraid. Small acts of resistance began to ripple across Dominion space. Workers sabotaged production lines. Technicians provided intelligence to human agents. Ship crews looked the other way when human raiders slipped through patrol zones. None of it was enough to threaten the Dominion directly, but all of it together created a web of small problems that consumed resources and attention. Executor or watched his empire begin to unravel and felt rage unlike anything he had experienced in his long life. He had ruled for 5 centuries. He had crushed 100 threats to Dominion supremacy. He had never faced an enemy that refused to know its place, that kept fighting after every defeat should have taught it submission, that somehow turned every victory into a rallying cry for more resistance. He summoned his war council and raged at them for hours. He demanded to know how a species barely a decade into interstellar travel was humiliating the greatest power in galactic history. He threatened executions and demotions and collective punishment. His admirals stood in silence and accepted his fury because they had no answers to give him. Finally, when his rage had burned itself out, or made his decision, "Assemble the Grand Fleet," he ordered. "Every warship in Dominion space, every vessel capable of combat. We will go to their home system. We will destroy their world. We will exterminate their species down to the last child. And we will broadcast their extinction to every corner of the galaxy as a reminder of what happens to those who defy us." His admirals exchanged uneasy glances. The Grand Fleet had not been assembled in 1,000 years. It was the ultimate expression of Dominion power, reserved for threats that demanded absolute destruction. To use it against a single young species seemed excessive, perhaps even desperate. But none of them dared to argue. Or's eyes burned with hatred that had consumed his reason. He would have his vengeance, and nothing in the galaxy would stop him. The orders went out. Across Dominion space, warships began converging on assembly points. 2,000 vessels, the greatest armada in galactic history, prepared to descend upon Earth, or would lead them personally from his flagship, the Eternal Throne. He would watch humanity burn and laugh as they died. In her office on Earth, Admiral Vance received intelligence reports tracking the Grand Fleet's assembly. She studied the numbers and felt a cold clarity settle over her mind. This was the battle they had been preparing for. This was the moment everything would be decided. She opened a channel to Captain, who was raiding a Dominion outpost 3 sectors away. She said, "It is time to come home. The final battle is coming." His response was calm, almost eager. "Understood, Admiral, I will be there." She closed the channel and looked out her window at the blue curve of Earth below. 7 billion people living their lives, trusting her to protect them. She would not fail them. Whatever the cost, whatever the sacrifice, humanity would survive this day. The Grand Fleet was coming, and humanity was ready. The Grand Fleet arrived in the Sol system like a plague of stars. 2,000 warships emerged from faster-than-light travel in a wall of metal and death that stretched across the void. At their center flew the Eternal Throne, largest vessel ever constructed by the Dominion, a mobile fortress bristling with weapons capable of cracking planets. On its command deck, Executor or stood before a massive viewport and gazed upon Earth for the first time. It was a beautiful world, blue oceans and white clouds and patches of green where life flourished in abundance. 7 billion humans lived on that fragile sphere, going about their small lives, unaware that their extinction had arrived, or felt no sympathy for them. They had challenged the Dominion. They had humiliated his fleet and killed his admiral and made him look weak before the entire galaxy. For that, they would all die. He activated his broadcast system, transmitting on all frequencies so that every human ship, every orbital station, every receiver on the planet below would hear his words. "Humans of Sol," he said, "your defiance ends today. You are surrounded by the greatest armada in galactic history. Your fleet is insignificant. Your weapons are toys. Your species is a footnote waiting to be erased. I offer you one chance. Surrender unconditionally, and I will grant a quick death to your population. Resist, and I will burn your world to ash and salt your system so that nothing grows here for 1,000 years." He waited for their response, expecting pleas for mercy or desperate offers of negotiation. Instead, Admiral Vance's voice came through his speakers, calm and cold as vacuum. "Come and try," or smiled and gave the order to advance. The Battle of Earth began in the void between Mars and the asteroid belt. Human ships rose from hidden positions throughout the system, far fewer than the Dominion force, but committed to fight to the last. Orbital platforms around Earth and Luna activated their weapons. Ground-based installations on 3 continents powered up that could throw projectiles into orbit. Everything humanity had built, everything they had hidden, everything they had prepared for 30 years, came online at once. The Dominion fleet met them head-on. Energy beams and kinetic projectiles crossed in the void, creating a web of destruction that claimed ships from both sides. Human vessels died in groups, overwhelmed by sheer numbers, but each one took Dominion ships with it. The Doctrine's raiders struck from unexpected angles, targeting engines and weapons systems, crippling vessels and leaving them to drift while the main battle raged. Captain commanded from the bridge of the Relentless, his crew fighting with desperate precision. They had been raiding for weeks, dancing at the edge of death, but this was different. This was the final stand. There would be no retreat, no regrouping, no living to fight another day. They would win here or humanity would cease to exist. "Alpha Wing, protect the orbital platforms," he ordered. "Beta Wing, focus on their carrier group. Do not let them launch fighters into Earth's atmosphere." His ships obeyed, throwing themselves into the teeth of the Dominion assault. The Relentless herself took hit after hit, her shields failing section by section, her hull breaching in a dozen places. Felt his ship dying around him and refused to give the order to withdraw. In Earth orbit, Dawson coordinated from the Central Command Station. She was not a soldier, but she had become something else in the weeks since the massacre. She had become a symbol, a voice, a reminder of why humanity was fighting. Now she worked alongside military officers, directing communications, coordinating with allied species who had sent whatever help they could spare. They had sent 3 medical frigates and a cargo ship full of supplies. The Morn had provided intelligence on Dominion fleet patterns. A dozen smaller species had contributed what they could, not enough to change the battle's outcome, but enough to show that humanity was not alone. The galaxy was watching, and some of it was choosing sides. The Dominion advance slowed as the killing continued, or had expected to sweep aside human resistance in hours. Instead, his fleet was bleeding. Every ship lost was irreplaceable in the short term, and the humans refused to break. They fought with a fury that bordered on madness, throwing themselves into situations no sane species would accept. "Executor," his tactical officer reported, "we have lost 400 vessels. Human losses are estimated at 60%, but their remaining forces are concentrating around the 3rd planet." Or slammed his fist against his command console. "Then push forward, break through their lines. I want that world in flames within the hour." The Eternal Throne advanced, surrounded by the remaining dreadnoughts of the Grand Fleet, its weapons carved through human defenders, opening a path toward Earth. The orbital platforms fought back, but they were being overwhelmed. The ground-based fired continuously until their barrels melted from the heat. Watched the flagship break through and knew what he had to do. "All hands," he announced to his crew, "this is the captain. The Relentless has taken critical damage. Our engines are failing. Our weapons are nearly exhausted. But the Dominion flagship is advancing on Earth, and we are the only ship in position to intercept." He paused, looking around his bridge at the faces of people who had followed him into hell and back. None of them showed fear. None of them looked away. "I am going to ram the eternal throne," he said. "Anyone who wishes to evacuate has 60 seconds to reach the escape pods. No one will think less of you. But if you stay, we end this together." Not one person moved. The Relentless accelerated on its final course. Dominion Point Defense fire tore at the dying destroyer, stripping away armor and hull plating, held the ship steady, aiming for the massive engines of the Eternal Throne. At the last moment, he saw Or's flagship try to maneuver, try to evade, but it was too large and too slow. The Relentless struck the Eternal Throne at the junction between its engine section and main hull. The destroyer's reactor detonated on impact, tearing a wound in the flagship that exposed decks to vacuum and sent the massive vessel spinning off course. Its shields flickered and died. Its weapons fell silent. Saw it happen on her tactical display. She saw the Relentless vanish in a bloom of fire and knew that and his entire crew were gone. Tears streamed down her face, but she did not look away. "All ground stations," she ordered, her voice steady despite her grief, "target the Eternal Throne. Fire everything." On 3 continents spoke in unison. Kinetic projectiles traveling at tremendous velocity converged on the crippled flagship. The first impact shattered its command tower. The second cracked its hull in 2. The third and fourth and fifth reduced the greatest warship in Dominion history to an expanding cloud of debris. Executor Or died without knowing what had killed him. One moment he was screaming orders, trying to restore control of his stricken vessel. The next moment, he was atoms scattered across the void. The death of their leader and flagship broke the Dominion fleet. Ships that had been pressing the attack suddenly found themselves without coordination, without orders, without the will to continue. Human vessels, battered but unbroken, pressed their advantage. The Grand Fleet, reduced to less than 1,000 ships, began a desperate retreat. They fled. The greatest armada in galactic history ran from the species they had meant to exterminate. In the aftermath, human rescue ships combed the battlefield for survivors while repair crews worked to save crippled vessels. The cost had been staggering. Over half of humanity's fleet was destroyed. Tens of thousands of sailors would never come home. The orbital platforms were wrecked, and Earth herself bore scars from debris that had fallen through the atmosphere. But they had won. 2 weeks later, the Galactic Concord convened an emergency session. Dawson, wearing a new diplomatic uniform with a black armband in memory of the fallen, stood before the assembly. The same delegates who had watched her friends murdered now looked at her with something between fear and respect. "Humanity did not seek this war," she said. "We came to you asking only for recognition and partnership. We were answered with violence. We responded in kind. The Dominion has learned what happens when humanity is pushed beyond the breaking point. We hope no other species will need the same lesson." She paused, looking around the chamber at the faces of 100 alien civilizations. "We remain willing to pursue peace. We remain open to cooperation and trade and mutual respect. But let this be understood by all. Humanity will never submit to tyranny. We will never bow to threats. We will never stop fighting for our right to exist. If you come to us as friends, you will find no species more loyal. If you come to us as enemies, you will find no species more dangerous." The Galactic Concord voted unanimously to grant humanity full sovereign status and a permanent seat on the ruling council. The Enmorn and others who had helped began negotiations for formal alliances. The Dominion, broken and humiliated, retreated to their core systems to lick their wounds. Walked out of the chamber into a corridor full of stars. She thought of Cole and in all the others who had given everything so that humanity could stand here today. She would carry their memory for the rest of her life. Diplomacy had collapsed. Humanity had responded with fearsome force, and the galaxy would never forget what they had learned. Never threaten humanity. because when pushed, they push back harder than anyone could imagine.